maybe we need missiology for lead pastors, because in so many ways, these leaders hit a ceiling with the level of influence that they can have on a congregation. And it's lead pastors who are, here's a new way to use UPG, the unopened pastoral gateway. They're meant to be the statesperson, the statesman for, missions cultivation in the entire congregation.
The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership between 1615 and Missio Nexus, who have a shared passion to mobilize the people of God to be a part of His mission.
Well, greetings and welcome once again to the Mission Matters podcast. I am Matthew Ellison, and of course, I am joined by my dear friend and co-host, Ted Essler. Greetings, Ted.
Hey, Matthew. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. We've had the privilege of connecting face-to-face around the country lately. It's been great.
Yes, most recently in Phoenix for the Urbana Conference, and that was a great deal of fun, and what a wonderful event.
That's right. In fact, we'll be doing a highlight podcast for the Urbana Conference. What happened? What's next? Looking forward to that one.
And I think maybe for our audience, for full disclosure, Matthew, we should tell them that as of January 1st, Matthew is a Missio Nexus board member, and so he's kind of like one of my 12 or 13 bosses.
That's right, Ted. It's been a joy to walk alongside Missio in ministry for the last probably 7, 8, 9 years, maybe more. And now to be invited onto the board is a real privilege.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you as a board member, and I'm sure God's going to leverage that for the kingdom.
Yeah, the future is as bright as the promises of God, my brother. So today's guest is a seasoned missiologist, a visionary church planner, and an equipper of local church leaders. He has authored books such as The Sending Church Defined, The Sending Church Applied, and we are here today to talk about his newest book, Missiology for Missions Pastors, which is actually a collaboration between Upstream Equipping and Missio Nexus. He currently serves as the Executive Director of Upstream Equipping, so please join me in welcoming Bradley Bell. Brad, good to have you on the podcast today.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Great to be here. And Ted, great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you as well.
Hey, do I call you Brad or Bradley? I just called you Brad like we've been friends, for our whole lives, but what do you go by?
I like that. Most people call me Brad, but I also respond to Bradley. When it ends up on the front of books, people tend to use that name. So either way.
Well, I'm going to call you Bradley today because that's what's on the front of your book. So you actually co-edited this book with Ted Essler.
Absolutely. Ted approached me in 2024, I think that's correct, with an idea for the book. Ted, I would like for you to tell that story. I think you might tell it better than me.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of missiological things out there that are really not applicable in a local church context. And at the same time, there's a lot of mission pastors that have not had the benefit of missiological training. And it just seemed like there was a gap, something that was kind of in reach of most people. So, not the kind of missiology that's so academic that it's impractical in a local church context. And I thought, a book like this really should be done by a publisher with a specific emphasis on the local church. And so as I started to think about various Missio Nexus members that are really engaged in the local church, I realized Upstream Collective has a whole catalog of books they've created specifically designed to serve in a local church context, that they make an excellent partner on a book like this. And so I connected with Brad, and we began the process of talking about what it could look like as a collaboration. And out at the other end came Missiology for Mission Pastors.
I don't have my copy. I feel like I'm left out here.
Oh, no, we need to get you a copy, Matthew.
That's right. I'll get one. So, Ted, you kind of addressed this, why now, why this book, but I'd like to hear Bradley's perspective as well.
Yeah, we were so honored when Ted approached us with this idea, and we were totally on board because we see missions leaders all the time who don't have that missions field experience, nor that missiological training that came from college or seminary. And so we wanted to give them something that wasn't a textbook that would be overwhelming, intimidating, and in many ways impractical to the nature of their role in the context of the local church. And so we went for it as a compilation work, drawing from 10 different authors who are kind of very diverse in their context. I also think that more than ever before, the church needs missiology that is gospel centered, biblically based, spirit guided, church informed, relationally robust. That meaning it's drawing from the global church and not just Western context, and it's comprehensively practical. We want readers to be able to pick this up and put it into practice. And so, as a former lead pastor, so many misunderstandings that I am perceiving among believers culturally and then in the church itself seems to come from this massive gap in understanding good, healthy missiology.
So, where do missions pastors typically get their missiology? You mentioned maybe they're not getting it at seminary or Bible college. Where are they getting it from?
And that's a great question. Part of me wants to turn the question back to you, Matthew, and see what you have discovered as you guys did research for your book, The Sending Shepherd. But what I'm discovering as I talk with missions leaders all over the world now is a lot of it comes from personal missions experience, their own passion and transformation that has occurred from engaging in God's mission. They've had an encounter through something maybe like Perspectives that has also at times launched them into this interest. Of course, they're reading books, they're reading blogs, they're being influenced by missions organizations. They're often influenced by the denominational or tribal affiliation that they've kind of grown up in or been formed within. But more than ever, I mean, media is massively impacting missions leaders. They're listening to podcasts, they're watching YouTube, they're going to conferences and being influenced by movements that are Urbana based. But even beyond, just last week, here in Louisville, we saw two different versions of the CrossCon that brought in thousands of students. So a lot of influence is flowing through those means.
I would just give you a little story about this. A couple of weeks ago, I met with a missions pastor. So I live in Florida. So in my area here, I met with the missions pastor. And as we sat down, I asked him about his story. He came to the church initially as the youth pastor. And over the course of the last 6 or so years, he's become the executive pastor, executive second in command, basically. And missions has fallen into his lap. And so it's one of many hats that he wears. And this is not a small church. This is a church of 3,000 to 4,000 people. And I asked him, what kind of missions training or background do you have? And he kind of chuckled. He goes, well, I've been on a couple of missions trips. And for better or for worse, I think in many churches, this is kind of the pattern that we've seen, that I've seen anyway, is people come into the church and whoever was doing the missions program at that church leaves or the changes are made, and eventually it gets sent to somebody without a lot of background. Not always the case, of course, but I think it is very common. And I gave him a copy of the book, and he just said, I've never seen any resource like this for somebody doing my role. So this is really awesome. So I do think it kind of hits that need, and that's really the purpose of the book and why it needed to be written.
Since you opened up that door, Bradley, I'll jump into that. I think what you said, what Ted said is right. It's perspectives. It's a short-term trip. Someone's invited on a short-term trip, whether it's a pastor or a lay leader, and they get exposed to God's heart for the nations. And so they have kind of a quick study in missiology. I think a lot of missions pastors are self-educated when it comes to missiology. I don't know if they're getting a robust missiology at seminary. I tend to think they're not. You mentioned the Sending Shepherd book. One of the things that surfaced was that seminary grads report low passion for missions. Now, I'm not saying it's causation. I'm not saying you go to seminary and you get demissionized, but for sure we're graduating people that don't have a robust missiology. And so I think a lot of it is self-educated and experiential, as both of you mentioned, which is why I want to say I think this is the time for this book, because I just met with a missions pastor in Phoenix where we're doing some work with churches there. And Ted, the situation you described is exactly what happened. It was kind of thrown into his lap. He had some exposure to short-term missions. He had some roles in the church. And now, lo and behold, he's the missions pastor. So what a great resource. What a great time for a resource like this. So Bradley, I'm curious what kind of responses you've received so far for the book.
Yeah, so the book was just released in September, so we haven't gotten a ton of editorial, kind of reviews just yet. It takes time for folks to be able to dig through the book, especially going into the holiday season. But some of the things that we've gotten back that have been encouraging, really, one is a response from our African brothers and sisters who have already gotten access to the book in many ways because one of the authors was Ray Mensah in Ghana, and he's distributing the book, far and wide on the continent. And the response that we're getting is, hey, thank you so much. This is going to be so helpful to our pastors and our missions pastors because there's a growing amount of missions pastors in particular in these churches. And they're saying, hey, can we learn more? How can we jump into more training on how to do these things well? So that's deeply encouraging. It was on one of the top 16 books by Catalyst Services of 2025, which is always a nice thing. One reviewer, you appreciate his honesty, was like, yeah, there's not really nothing new in the book, but the chapters on the role of the missions pastor are incredibly helpful. And I think we'll talk more about, why that review is actually a pretty good description of the book a little later in the episode. But one person said it's helpful for not being overwhelmed because it really distills what are those key areas that a missions leader is looking at. And then there's also been an appreciation of the diversity in the book. There's male and female voices. There's an African American leader. There's an African leader. There are actual missions pastors who are first time authors who wrote chapters and they know what they're talking about. So those are some of the things that we've heard that people appreciate.
So the title, Missiology for Mission Pastors, you mentioned you have some female voices in there, and depending on what tradition you're a part of, you may have women that are ordained or not ordained. Something I run into a lot is missions directors who are female. I would say the majority of my interaction with church leaders, that contact point is a woman. So I'm glad you bring that up. And I would just want to mention that this is not just for a traditional pastor model. It's for missions director as well. Would you say it's applicable for that?
I would say so. And, we tend to use Missio Nexus. We tend to call them church mission leaders instead of mission pastors for the very reason that you outlined. But you got to admit, missiology for mission pastors kind of rolls off the tongue just very nicely. So we felt like that probably needed to be the title. But certainly many people that are in charge of mission programs at local churches are women. And so I hope they feel very much embraced as they read the book and see that there's a number of female perspectives provided.
Yeah. Could you touch on the type of missiological depth that's in the book? You mentioned that it's very practical, and I'm glad it's practical. We need those simple tools that we can put into action. But what type of depth? Where does that come from?
Yeah, I can start with that. And then, Ted, I'd love to hear what your thought is on it. I think if you're looking for a thorough missiological study, like this is probably not the book for you. I think there are many fantastic textbooks on missiology that are out there. And in producing this, we weren't trying to compete with them on any level. However, I will say two chapters that at times move beyond the introductory and get into deeper consideration are one, Jason Mandrick's chapter on the state of missions. There's some things that he gives that are very up to date, that are very challenging, and they're very global in perspective. That anybody who comes in with a pretty narrow perspective on missiology is going to be challenged to wrestle with. And then the other chapter that comes to mind is Brian Fickert's Practicing Word and Deed Ministry. He gives a framework in there that's really saturated in Genesis 1 and 2 that can inform all of missiological approach. And if you really take it into consideration instead of fly over it, it will challenge you. It'll make you really wrestle with the implications of what you are doing and how you're going about it, and through the church.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it would be selling the book short to say it's shallow. There's quite a bit of depth interspersed, but it is an introduction. It's a good read for somebody, let's say a newly appointed mission pastor. This is kind of like designed for that person that's in that kind of a role. And so I think approachable was a word we used a lot, accessible, as we talked to authors about how to think about the audience and who to write for.
I think that's important too. looking back to some of the previous things we've said, a lot of folks don't have formal education and they're looking for some ready handles where they can put into practice, what they've been asked to do. So I really appreciate the practical aspect of this book. Could you give us an overview of what's in the book and why a missions pastor might want to read it, or a missions director? So give us a high-level view and why it should be read.
Yeah, we divided the book into 3 key sections. The first section is Introduction to Missions. You've got J.D. Payne, Miriam Adonai, and Jason Mandrick really laying out like an overarching introductory view of healthy missiology, along with the history of missions and the current status of the world. So it's a quick flyover, but fantastic, well-known authors who bring a lot of goodness to the table right at the very beginning. And then you go into the middle section, which is on missions and the church. And this section brings in, 3 key long-time experienced missions leaders: Mark Byram, Dave Childers, Sharon Hoover. And they're really laying out, hey, what is this rise of the local church in missions? Where does that come from? What's that about? And then Dave Childers talks about the missions pastor's role as it is within the context of the church. There's kind of an inward-facing aspect to it. And then Sharon talks about the missions pastor's role among the nations, so more of that outward-facing engagement sort of aspects of the missions leader's role. And then the final section, we just wanted to hit some of those key topics that any new missions leader really needs to be taken into consideration. Doing short-term missions well, sending mid and long-term missionaries, practicing word and deed ministry, and then developing healthy partnerships, which is rounded out by Raymond Saw, referred to that earlier. Not obviously holistic list of the things that land on the plate of a missions leader, but those are some of those key elements that they need information about.
Yeah, and I would just, add that there's a forward and there's a concluding chapter, and the whole book really kind of just presses in on the idea that churches need to play a role in what's going on globally. And there's just such a wide open opportunity in chapter after chapter. The church is embraced, and you really can see the place of the local church in mission.
Yeah, Bradley, I want to pick up on something you said. You talked about the internal role of a missions pastor or director and then the external role. And I think we often don't think about that. We think about mostly the outward piece, but such a big part of that person's role is mobilizing the congregation that they're in. How do you connect every individual in that church to God's redemptive story? So I'm so thrilled to hear that a piece of it focuses on that, because that's a big part of the job. When I'm working with missions directors and missions pastors, that's probably the thing they talk about the most, honestly. I mean, they do talk about the field, they talk about the partners, but their biggest load, their biggest responsibility is to get the body connected to God's story. So I'm really glad that's a part of this. You've already hit on this a little bit, Bradley. Oh, you want to pick up on that a little bit?
Yeah, I was just going to say, last week I was in New Hampshire with Vision New England. They were doing a retreat for missions leaders, and they gathered feedback on what are the main issues that you would like to talk about and receive help about during the retreat. And the number one was mobilization. How do we mobilize our entire congregation? How do we cultivate a culture that is more than just a missions ministry? And so, Ted, maybe I'm going to pitch the idea to you this time and see if you catch it. Here's the idea. Maybe we need missiology for lead pastors, because in so many ways, these leaders hit a ceiling with the level of influence that they can have on a congregation. And it's lead pastors who are, here's a new way to use UPG, the unopened pastoral gateway. They're meant to be the statesperson, the statesman for, missions cultivation in the entire congregation. But they don't have missiological training a lot of times in their seminary education or emphasis. And so maybe that's the book that's like, hey, lead pastors, here's what you need to know.
Well, Matthew's book, The Sending Shepherd, does hit on that topic.
There you go. It's already out there.
Yeah. Well,
yeah. George Murray, the former chancellor of Columbia International, says that when it comes to missions in the church, the pastor either holds the key to the front door or the padlock. And you hit on it, Bradley. Such a key piece of that missions pastor director's role is, how do I pull my pastor into this engagement? Because so goes the pastor, so goes the church.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a really important piece of this. So maybe it's a 1-2 punch. They read missiology for missions pastors, and then they pull this piece in. How do I get my senior pastor advocating for the nations? You've already hit on this a little bit, Bradley. My question is this predominantly a Western-oriented perspective? I realize most of your authors, you do have Ray Mensa, but it's going all throughout Africa, so apparently not. Is this primarily written for the West?
The authors all are American except for Ray, but we did ask the authors to use universal illustrations and to avoid American idioms. However, like you said, we are already seeing it being used globally. Connected with a pastor in Ukraine who also wanted to take advantage of it. So many components, I think, translate well cross-culturally, but there will always have to be some measure of contextualization. I think Miriam and Ray's chapters have the power to awaken someone beyond their Western blind spots. You know, Miriam is such a fantastic author. She writes so artfully. And so her chapter on, the history of missions is really poetic almost in the way that it gets beyond the scope of what we're just doing here in the U.S. in our era of missions history. But I mean, what do you say to that, Ted?
Yeah, I would say for sure it is for a Western audience. Like you said, it's going to be spillover. But I would just say also that globally, mission pastors are mostly a U.S. expression on a church staff. Now, we all know, a big mega church in this country or a big mega church in this great urban center, et cetera, and they've got a mission team, et cetera. So I realize that those things are out there. Those churches are out there. But in reality, the mission pastor role itself is a relatively recent innovation. Probably if you dial back to the 1970s, you would find very few mission pastors. Today, there's, a fair number of them, but also the majority of them are working in the West. And so I think it's appropriate. I think the book does have some balance in this area, but it is mostly skewed toward a Western audience.
I do have some friends in Cameroon, a collection of 6 missions pastors, and that's literally their role and their primary role in the context of the church. And they're putting these things into practice in a tremendously parallel way, and in many ways showing me, giving an example of how to do it even better. So I'm excited to learn from them as other parts of the global church begin to emphasize this particular role in the context of the church.
So I'd like both of you to answer this next question. Which chapters stick out to you that have the most application for your typical church missions leader or pastor, the ones that really stand out? And I'm putting you on the spot because it's a collaboration, so I'm asking you to pick your favorite chapters, essentially.
Well, for me, the Brian Fickert chapter is the one I think that's got the most, how do we want to say it, intriguing, kind of complex things for churches to think about, because he really presses in on rethinking how we even can, especially short-term mission, how churches go about seeing that and conducting that. And I think it's the one chapter that has the most potential, I think, to change how a church might conceive of and do mission in its local context. That would be my view. Brad, would you agree with that or not?
I love that chapter. And at the same time, we wrestled with that chapter in the editorial process tremendously, that and Jason Mandrick's chapter, because it was like, man, some of these things are not within the normal parameters of mainstream missiology, and in a good way. And yet, is this going to be too challenging for readers? And, we ended up keeping, the chapters very closely to what they were. I think you're dead on with Brian's chapter, and he's brilliant, in the work that he's done with When Helping Hurts speaks for itself, right? So I would say, if kind of depends. If you have no missiological education and you're in this role, I would encourage you to camp out in the first 3 chapters. And because this is a compilation book, you can kind of pick and choose. You can go through the whole thing, of course, but you can pick and choose. I'd say if you're new to the role, or the role is new to the church itself, those middle 3 chapters could be really, really helpful to kind of get a framework, maybe even to frame a job description to hire someone into this role. And then finally, I would say if you're wrestling with specific issues and you're already in your role, I would look for those issues in those back 4 chapters and dive in to what resonates there. Yeah.
I would add to the chapter that Miriam wrote, The History of Mission. Imagine you're asked to write the history of mission, and you're given this very short number of words to fit that into. And she just did a masterful job. It's really great. And there's just, you can actually gain a lot of insight just in one chapter. And so I also say that's a really great, that's a great read.
So both of you encourage the missions director, the missions pastor serving in a local church context. Maybe they're paid, maybe it's a vocation, maybe they're volunteer, probably volunteer. I would say the vast majority are volunteer. So encourage them.
Well, I would just say, like dial back to 1970 and you're thinking about the big missions picture and you're saying to yourself, what if we moved an activist directly into local churches? What difference would that make? And in many ways, that's what's happened in the last 50 or so years is we've put frontline activists directly into local congregations. And I would just say, don't underestimate the key strategic nature of what that does for a local church body, and take every opportunity to leverage that for the Global Great Commission, because I think it is a very strategic thing to have in your church as somebody who's committed to thinking about the global mission of the church.
So good. Yeah, if that resonates with you as a listener, I just encourage you to read Ted's introduction to the book because he speaks to that even more fully there, and it's really so rich. I mean, what comes to mind for me, Matthew, is just saying to you, hey, who you are and what you do matters.
Yeah.
God sees it. He cares. He's proud of you. He's for you, not against you. And I say all that because I've been a missions pastor and I know the unique joys of it and the unique trials, how you can often find yourself in a place that is literally and figuratively a foreign ministry to those around you. And that's a difficult place to be, to be misunderstood, to be, maybe neglected in terms of communication or opportunity or even budget, right? Mm-hmm. So I just want to say to you from my heart, you matter and your work really matters, and God is going to use it in ways that will change the world.
Yeah. I think it was Ralph Winter. I got to verify, but I'm going to give it to Ralph Winter right now. Someone who can mobilize 100 people to get to the field is more important than one who goes to the field. Not to minimize the one who goes, but when I think of a missions director, missions pastor, it's not just mobilizing people to go to the field, it's mobilizing a whole body into God's story. Yeah. So mobilization matters. You're awakening people to the greatest movement in history. I was a missions pastor as well, and I work with missions pastors and directors all over the country. And I tell them, we need to reframe what mobilization is. We view it as this recruitment project for God's waning labor force. But what about a shift? What if we saw it as a prophetic invitation to the people of God to be a part of the greatest movement in history? Just that simple reframing, I think, is so helpful. You don't need to beg people into this. You just need to invite them into what God's doing around the world. So I just want to build on what both of you said. Missions director, missions pastor, your role is so significant and crucial to the cause today. So this has been a great conversation. It was fun to interview both Ted and Bradley. I don't always get to do that. So where can they pick up this book?
So the book is available on Amazon and Kindle and in print. And if you're interested in bulk orders, that is copies of 10 or more, please reach out to me, Bradley, at theupstreamcollective.org, and we can get you a much better price than Amazon would.
I want to add, too, we have a lot of agency folks listening. And if you're in recruitment, mobilization, church partnership, one of the things I always encourage people to do is come in with a resource or a tool. As you're interacting with missions pastors and directors, here's a really simple, practical, theological tool to place in the hands of those you serve. So I hope our listeners will take advantage of that. Brothers, thanks for being on the call today.
Thank you, Matthew. Appreciate it.
Thank both of you guys.
Thank you, Bradley.
Really grateful.
Before you go, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership of 1615 and Missio Nexus. Check out 1615.org and missionexus.org for more resources on the mission of God and the matters of the mission. The Mission Matters podcast is hosted by Matthew Ellison, president of 1615, and Ted Essler, president of Missio Nexus.